Marxism and the Oppression of Women, section, Beyond Domestic Labor. The preceding chapter established some basic concepts pertaining to the reproduction of labor power, and used them to address the question of women's oppression in class society. We can now turn to the problem of women's oppression in the context of capitalist social reproduction. In capitalist societies, exploitation takes place through the appropriation of surplus value, and surplus labor appears in the form of wage labor. Labor power acquires the particular form of a commodity, bought and sold on the market. This commodity possesses the peculiarly useful property, as Marx discovered, of being a source of value. Although it is exchanged in the market, it is not a commodity like any other, for it is not produced capitalistically. Instead, some process of reproduction of the bearers of exploitable labor power continually brings labor power into being as a commodity. Such a process is a condition for the existence of capital. In Marx's words, the worker, quote, constantly produces material, objective wealth, but in the form of capital, of an alien power that dominates and exploits him, and the capitalist as constantly produces labor power, but in the form of a subjective source of wealth, separated from the objects in and by which it can alone be realized. In short, he produces the laborer, but as a wage laborer. This incessant reproduction, this perpetuation of the laborer, is the sine qua non of capitalist production. End quote. Such dramatic statements are true in a broad sense, but they shed little light on the theoretical status of the reproduction of labor power in capitalist society, and even less on the manner in which it takes place. Footnote. Marx's famous comments that the laborer belongs to himself and performs his necessary vital functions outside the process of production, a performance, quote, the capitalist may safely leave to the laborer's instincts of self-preservation and of propagation, end quote, implicitly recognize reproduction of labor power as a process that must remain external to capitalist commodity production. His unfortunate phrasing, quite rightly the object of feminist criticism, appears to exempt the process from theoretical examination, however, and conceals the kernel of genuine theoretical insight. Molyneux argues that domestic labor, as privatized individual labor not subject to the law of value, lies outside the theory of the capitalist mode of production. But she does not deny the importance of developing a Marxist analysis of domestic labor in capitalist society. End footnote. Capitalist reproduction demands that labor power be available as a commodity for purchase in adequate quantity and quality, and at an appropriate price. However imperfectly, these needs shape the processes that maintain the existing bearers of labor power, while at the same time the labor force as a whole is continually reconstituted to accord with future needs. The manner in which the sellers of labor power live out their lives is, in principle, a manner of indifference to the capitalist class. By contrast, it represents a central concern for the bearers of labor power. In this sense, the circumstances under which reproduction of labor power takes place, which include the determination of its price, are always an outcome of class struggle. Several characteristics of the reproduction of labor power and women's oppression in capitalist society arise from the logic of capitalist accumulation itself. Perhaps most consequential is the special form taken by necessary labor. Necessary labor becomes divided into two components. One, which we can call the social component of necessary labor, is indissolubly bound with surplus labor in the capitalist production process. As Marx showed, the working day in capitalist employment includes a certain amount of time during which the worker produces value equivalent to the value of the commodities necessary for the reproduction of his or her labor power. This is, for Marx, the worker's necessary labor, for which he or she is paid. For the rest of the working day, the worker produces surplus value for the capitalist, value for which he or she is not paid. From the point of view of the worker, however, no distinction exists between necessary and surplus labor time, and the wage appears to cover both. In Marx's words, quote, The wage form thus extinguishes every trace of the division of the working day into necessary labor and surplus labor, into paid and unpaid labor. All labor appears as paid labor." End quote. Marx did not identify a second component of necessary labor in capitalist society, one that we can call the domestic component of necessary labor, or domestic labor. Domestic labor is the portion of necessary labor that is performed outside the sphere of capitalist production. For the reproduction of labor power to take place, both the domestic and the social components of necessary labor are required. That is, wages may enable a worker to purchase commodities, but additional labor, domestic labor, must generally be performed before they are consumed. In addition, many of the labor processes associated with the generational replacement of labor power are carried out as part of domestic labor. In capitalist societies, then, the relationship between surplus and necessary labor has two aspects. On the one hand, the demarcation between surplus labor and the social component of necessary labor is obscured through the payment of wages in the capitalist labor process. On the other hand, the domestic component of necessary labor becomes dissociated from wage labor, the arena in which surplus labor is performed. As accumulation proceeds, the opposition between wage labor and domestic labor sharpens. Capitalism's drive to increase surplus value by enhancing productivity, especially through industrialization, forces a severe spatial, temporal, and institutional separation between domestic labor and the capitalist production process. Capitalists must organize production so that more and more of it is under their direct control in workshops and factories, where wage labor is performed for specific amounts of time. Wage labor comes to have a character that is wholly distinct from the laborer's life away from the job, including his or her involvement in the domestic component of necessary labor. At the same time, the wage mediates both daily maintenance and generational replacement processes, supplemented or sometimes replaced by state contributions. That is, the social component of the worker's necessary labor facilitates the reproduction of labor power indirectly, by providing money that must be then exchanged to acquire commodities. These two characteristics, the separation of wage labor from domestic labor and the payment of wages, are materialized in the development of specialized sites and social units for the performance of domestic labor. Working-class families located in private households represent the dominant form in most capitalist societies. But domestic labor also takes place in labor camps, barracks, orphanages, hospitals, prisons, and other such institutions. Footnote: the units for the performance of the domestic component of necessary labor can be analyzed in terms of what has been called the double separation of the direct producer, who neither owns nor possesses the means and conditions of capitalist production. The payment of wages and the isolated domestic labor site embody this double separation. Wage laborers cannot appropriate or own surplus value. Neither can they activate or possess the concrete labor process. In this sense, the payment of wages corresponds to the worker's lack of ownership of any property, save his or her own labor power. Spatial, temporal, and institutional separation of the site of domestic labor from that of wage labor reflects the worker's inability to set the instruments of social labor in motion. In sum, bearers of labor power are in a state of non-ownership and non-possession of the means and conditions of production. From this point of view, the units for the performance of domestic labor constitute a special subset of social units in capitalist society. They are concrete forms taken by the relation between the working class's non-ownership and non-possession of the means and conditions of production. Note Poulanca's characterization of the enterprise as, quote, the concrete form of the relation between an economic ownership and possession that both belong to capital. Because these social units materialize a definite relationship to the means of and conditions of production, namely non-ownership and non-possession on the part of the bearers of labor power. They cannot be viewed as private enclaves, developing in relative isolation from the processes of capitalist production. The form, composition, and internal structure of the special set of social units acting as sites for domestic labor are, in fact, directly affected by the course of capitalist accumulation. Footnote continued. In a limited sense, the social units in which the domestic component of necessary labor takes place are the counterparts of capitalist enterprises. From this point of view, Bettelheim's discussion of the displacement of the limits of the enterprise with the rise of monopoly capitalism suggests a similar conceptualization of the development of family households in capitalist society. The removal of certain functions from the private household, for example, and the development of collective consumption represent analogous displacements of limits. It must be emphasized that to speak of the units of domestic labor as counterparts to those of capitalist production implies no simple parallelism. End of footnote. In capitalist societies, the burden of the domestic component of necessary labor rests disproportionately on women, while the provision of commodities tends to be disproportionately the responsibility of men, fulfillable through participation in wage labor. This differential positioning of women and men with respect to surplus labor and the two components of necessary labor, which is generally accompanied by a system of male supremacy, originates as a historical legacy from the oppressive divisions of labor in earlier class societies. It is then strengthened by the particular separation between domestic and wage labor, generated by the capitalist mode of production. Domestic labor increasingly takes place in specialized social units, whose isolation in space and time from wage labor is further emphasized by male supremacy. These conditions stamp domestic labor with its specific character. Experientially, the particular nature of domestic labor in industrial capitalist society gives rise, for both women and men, to intense feelings of opposition between one's private life and some public sphere. The highly institutionalized demarcation of domestic labor from wage labor, in a context of male supremacy, forms the basis for a series of powerful ideological structures, which develop a forceful life of their own. Isolation of the units of domestic labor appears to be a natural separation of women from men as well. Confinement to a world that is walled off from capitalist production seems to be woman's time-honored natural setting. A series of correlated opposites embodies the seemingly universal division of life into two spheres of experience: private and public, domestic and social, family and work, women and men. Rooted in the economic workings of the capitalist mode of production, and reinforced by a system of male supremacy, this ideology of separate spheres has a force that is extremely difficult to transcend. Where some categories of male workers command wages sufficient to maintain a private household, staffed by a non-working wife, the ideology takes a particularly stubborn institutional form. The drive for accumulation causes constant change in capitalist societies, including changes in the quantity and character of the domestic component of necessary labor. As Marx demonstrated, capitalist accumulation depends on the growth of surplus labor, appropriated in the form of absolute and relative surplus value. He discussed these two forms of augmented surplus value in terms of a particular society's established working day of 10 hours in capitalist production, divided into 5 hours each of necessary and surplus labor. If the hours of work are extended to, say, 12 hours, the capitalists appropriate 2 hours' worth of absolute surplus value for each worker. If the amount of necessary labor falls to, say, 4 hours, they appropriate an hour's worth of relative surplus value for each worker. While both processes contribute to capitalist accumulation, relative surplus value ordinarily plays a greater part, for the established working day of an individual can only be extended so far. Marx analyzed two major ways of producing relative surplus value that are available to the capitalists: introduction of machinery, technological improvements, and the like, and the reduction in the costs of the means of subsistence. Together, he noted, they fuel capitalism's penetration into all sectors of social life. Capital's need to augment surplus value implies a contradiction between domestic labor and wage labor. As a component of necessary labor, domestic labor potentially takes away from the commitment workers can make to performing surplus labor through participation in wage work. Objectively, then, it competes with capital's drive for accumulation. If one tends one's own garden plot, chops one's own firewood, cooks one's own meals, and walks 6 miles to work, the amount of time and energy available for wage labor is less than if one buys food in a supermarket, lives in a centrally heated apartment building, eats in restaurants, and takes public transportation to work. Similarly, if one supports another person, for example a wife, in order that she take care of domestic labor, that person is less available to participate in wage labor, while at the same time one's own wage must cover the costs of her means of consumption. To the extent that the domestic labor of a capitalist society takes place within private households, the pressure of capitalist accumulation results in a tendency to decrease the amount performed in each household. That is, the domestic component of necessary labor is severely reduced. At the same time, more household members may enter the workforce, increasing the total amount of wage labor performed by the household, a phenomenon akin to intensification of a single worker's labor. In short, reduction of domestic labor potentially creates both relative and absolute surplus value. A major way to reduce domestic labor is to socialize its tasks. Laundromats, stores selling ready-made clothing, and fast food chains, for instance, remove domestic labor tasks to the profit-making sector, where they also provide new opportunities for capitalist entrepreneurs. Public education and healthcare make aspects of domestic labor the responsibility of the state, at the same time distributing the costs of the reproduction of labor power more widely through contributions and taxes. A society's total domestic labor can also be reduced by employing institutionalized populations, prison labor, army labor, and by importing migrant labor from outside national boundaries. Over time, the tendency to reduce domestic labor affects the units in which it is performed in numerous ways, many of which have been documented by scholars in terms of changes in the family and in the relationship between work and the family. The history of the tendency's impact on sites of reproduction of labor power that are not based on kin relations, prisons, dormitories, migrant labor camps, is less well studied. The domestic component of necessary labor cannot be completely socialized in capitalist society. The main barrier is economic, for the costs are extremely high in such areas as child-rearing and household maintenance. Profitable chains of daycare centers have yet to be developed, for example, and house cleaning services have not been able to reduce costs to a level that makes them available to working-class households. Political and ideological barriers to the socialization of domestic labor also play a role. Socialization of work formerly done in the home may be experienced as an attack on established working-class lifestyles, as when the introduction of public education encountered opposition among some working-class militants fearful of capitalist indoctrination. The recent expansion of nursing home care for the elderly has sometimes been opposed as part of a general decline in so-called traditional family values. Working-class families and capitalist societies have generally welcomed advances in the socialization of domestic labor, however. In doing so, they register their appreciation of the labor saved, as well as of the potential qualitative enhancement of social experience. Footnote: the liberating potential inherent in the socialization of domestic labor was especially evident in the 19th and early 20th centuries. See Hayden. End footnote. A different type of political barrier to the socialization of domestic labor exists in the case of migrant workers housed in dormitories or labor camps. Such arrangements reduce domestic labor and cheapen the cost of renewal, but, as recent events in South Africa show, they also represent a political threat to the ruling class by facilitating organization. An ultimate barrier to the socialization of domestic labor is constituted by biology. While domestic labor might conceivably be reduced to a minimum through the socialization of most of its tasks, the basic physiological process of childbearing will continue to be the province of women. Footnote. In their desire for equality and liberation, feminists have sometimes tried to abolish the role of biology. For example, Firestone calls for the, quote, freeing of women from the tyranny of their biology by any means available, end quote, including artificial reproduction outside the womb. See Firestone, Sayers for discussion of the contradictory and anti-materialist character of such positions. End footnote. The tendency for domestic labor to be reduced in capitalist society remains, of course, no more than a general trend. Actual arrangements develop out of and depend on the history of a particular society, and are affected by class conflict within it. It is in this context that such phenomena as the family wage, female labor force participation, discrimination against women in the labor market, protective legislation, and child labor laws must be analyzed. Generally speaking, the specific amounts and kinds of domestic labor performed in a particular society are an outcome of the struggle between contending classes at several levels. Domestic labor has, in fact, a highly contradictory role within capitalist social reproduction. On the one hand, it forms an essential condition for capitalism. If capitalist production is to take place, it must have labor power, and if labor power is to be available, domestic labor must be performed. On the other hand, domestic labor stands in the way of capitalism's drive for profit, for it also limits the availability of labor power. From the point of view of capital, domestic labor is simultaneously indispensable and an obstacle to accumulation. Over the long term, the capitalist class seeks to stabilize the reproduction of labor power at a low cost and with a minimum of domestic labor. At the same time, the working class, either as a united force or fragmented into competing sectors, strives to win the best conditions possible for its own renewal, which may include a particular level and type of domestic labor. Domestic labor takes as its raw material a certain quantity and quality of commodities bought with the wages workers obtain by selling labor power on the market. How are wages determined? In Marx's view, the value of labor power is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor incorporated in the means of subsistence needed to maintain and replace the laborer. That is, the value of labor power equals the value of the commodities the worker requires. Marx cautions, however, that into the determination of this value enters a historical and moral element. Two other factors also affect the determination of the value of labor power. First, the cost of developing labor power with the appropriate skills, and second, quote, its natural diversity, the difference between the labor power of men and women and of children and adults, a fact that makes a great difference in the cost of maintaining the family of the laborer and in the value of the labor power of the adult male, end quote. Throughout most of his argument, Marx makes the simplifying assumption that the effect of these various factors can be excluded. Footnote. For a more detailed exposition of Marx's discussion of the value and price of labor power and of wages, see Chapter 5. End footnote. Recent work on the value of labor power, particularly that developed in the context of socialist feminism, has pointed to ambiguities in Marx's formulation. Of special interest here is the discussion centered on the role of non-working women and other dependents supported by the worker's wage. The question of the contribution, if any, made by domestic labor to the determination of the value of labor power has given rise to a prolonged controversy known as the domestic labor debate, reviewed in Chapter 2. The most satisfactory answer to this question was first proposed by Ira Gerstein and developed in a more rigorous fashion by Paul Smith. Both argue that domestic labor, as concrete, useful labor, simply transfers the value of the commodities purchased with the wage to the labor power borne by the worker. The norm of the family wage, a wage paid to a single male worker, sufficient to cover the consumption of his entire family, represents for Gerstein a specific instance of how the, quote, historical and moral element affects the determination of the value of labor power. Footnote. Smith does not address the question of the destination of the value contained in the means of subsistence consumed by non-working household members, and says nothing about the family wage. The implication is that persons not engaged in wage labor somehow fall outside the capitalist mode of production. End footnote. That is, wage norms not only include a certain quantity and quality of commodities, they also imply a certain quantity and quality of domestic labor. The wage of a worker corresponds, then, to the total value of the commodities required for his or her maintenance and replacement in particular, historically established conditions. These conditions may or may not include such non-working dependents as wives, children, aged parents, and so forth. Existence of the family wage for some male workers has prompted discussion concerning the proper interpretation of the, quote, historical and moral element in this case. Some claim that the family wage represents a higher standard of living, and therefore a victory for the working class in its battle with capital. The family wage has been available, however, only to certain sectors within the working class. Most working class households in capitalist societies cannot manage on one income. Other commentators therefore argue that the family wage functions as a sort of concession made by capital to certain sectors of the working class, in return for a political stability based on male supremacy. In this view, the family wage constitutes not a victory, but a privilege offered to a subgroup of male workers. This controversy cannot be resolved in the abstract. The significance of the demand for and achievement of the family wage must be ascertained through concrete analysis, not logical deduction. It should be clear, however, that the presence of a non-working wife does not lower the value of male labor power, and therefore is not of inevitable benefit to the capitalist class. Quite the contrary. To have a wife not in the labor force requires a male wage large enough to cover the consumption of 2 adults. The capitalist class will evaluate such a wage level very carefully, weighing economic costs against political and ideological benefits and pressures. Footnote. For the controversy over the interpretation of the family wage, see Barrett and McIntosh. For clear discussions of how a dependent wife not in the labor force raises, rather than lowers, the value of labor power, see Holstrom or Molyneux. End footnote. Socialists have sometimes endorsed the family wage as part of a general strategy to defend the working class family, meaning a heterosexual nuclear unit with a single male wage earner. Defending the working class's right to the best conditions for its own renewal in no way entails a particular fixed social form, however. In some situations, the demand for a family wage may actually distort the legitimate fight for the best conditions possible for the reproduction of the working class as bearers of labor power. For example, where female-headed households make up a large sector of the population, demand for a family wage will most likely threaten women's position in the labor market, and deepen divisions already existing within the working class. In short, the specific content of socialist demands in the area of the reproduction of labor power, as elsewhere, must flow from a concrete analysis. As a first condition for developing such an analysis, socialists need to discard rigid ideological notions about the working class family as invariant, as the sole social unit in which labor power is maintained and replaced, and as the always deserving recipient of a family wage. Viewed from the perspective of overall social reproduction, the reproduction of labor power is not, it must be recalled, a bounded process of renewal of a fixed unit of population. Capitalist reproduction requires only that a more or less adequate labor force be available to set the production process in motion. In principle, capitalists may work the present labor force to death, so long as they have some means of recruiting a new one. In practice, they generally adopt other alternatives. Ordinarily, a society's active labor force is made up of some mix of established and new workers, the latter including children of established workers, members of the Industrial Reserve Army, and immigrants. At this level, the reproduction of labor power becomes a question of the reproduction of the working class as a whole. The term working class is sometimes interpreted as referring solely to wage workers. In this usage, for instance, only women workers would be considered working class women. Such categorization abandons all those not in the labor force, children, the elderly, and the disabled, as well as non-working wives, to a theoretical limbo outside the class structure. Here, the working class will be viewed as consisting of a society's past, present, and potential wage labor force, together with all those whose maintenance depends on the wage, but who do not or cannot themselves enter wage labor. At any given moment, it comprises the active labor force, the Industrial Reserve Army, and that portion of the relative surplus population not incorporated in the Industrial Reserve Army. The history of capitalism demonstrates that this last category has, at times, included very few persons, aside from infants and toddlers. Even those seriously handicapped from birth have sometimes been forced into the labor market, and have therefore belonged, however tenuously, to the Industrial Reserve Army. In order to place women theoretically in terms of the working class, some analysts have assigned them as the group to the Industrial Reserve Army. Women, they argue, form a reserve, which can be easily called upon during periods of expansion and returned to the home when no longer needed. Women not only participate in this cyclical movement, they represent an increasingly important element of the contemporary floating, latent, and stagnant layers within the Industrial Reserve Army. Most such discussions suggest, finally, that women's entry into the ranks of the Industrial Reserve Army is rather recent, and leave unanswered the question of their previous location within the working class. While this analysis of women in terms of their position in the Industrial Reserve Army is suggestive, a more adequate view would acknowledge that major sectors of the female population have been present in the Industrial Reserve Army for decades, even if, in Engels' words, quote, "It is only at times of exceptionally good trade that they realize it," end quote. Those working-class women not in the Industrial Reserve Army would form part of the relative surplus population. The question of women's position with respect to the Industrial Reserve Army is not, in fact, a theoretical one, but a matter for concrete analysis. Which groups of women in a given society move more actively between the Industrial Reserve Army and wage labor? How large are the numbers, and how intense the participation in the various sectors? Which groups of women remain locked in the relative surplus population outside the Industrial Reserve Army, and why? What are the political and ideological obstacles to certain women's entry into wage labor? What are the determinants of any movement that can be observed? In a particular capitalist society, for example, unmarried daughters living in their father's households may work until marriage. Elsewhere, daughters from rural areas may migrate to industrial concentrations, where they become the major support of families left behind. Women in immigrant, but not in native households, or black but not white mothers of school-aged children may enter wage labor. Wives may normally hold jobs until children are born, or after children enter school, or after they leave home. In periods of intensifying labor exploitation, mothers of preschool children may engage in wage labor. As Veronica Beachy points out, quote, "The question of who constitutes the preferred sources of the Industrial Reserve Army in any given historical situation must be concretely investigated. It cannot be derived from the logic of capitalism, but is determined by the class struggle, by the strategies employed by individual capitals, by trade union practices, and by state policies which are themselves a product of class struggle." End quote. Beachy argues that married women in Britain have been an important sector of the Industrial Reserve Army since World War II. To which it must be added that the general trend in the advanced capitalist countries is toward equalization of participation rates among different categories of women, in the direction of increased commitment of all women to wage labor. In the United States, for example, labor force participation rates among different groups of women have been converging. As many white as black wives are in the workforce. More mothers of very young children are now working, and so forth. Equalization of female labor force participation is a particular manifestation of the structural tendency in capitalist society toward free availability of all labor power. Like the tendency toward the reduction of domestic labor, this tendency embodies the forward drive of capitalist accumulation. Marx discussed it explicitly in the context of his analysis of competition among individual capitals. Capital moves from sectors of relatively low profit rate into sectors of high profit rate, thereby contributing to the equalization of the rate of profit in different branches of production and among different individual capitals. The more mobile capital and labor power can be, the more easily and quickly can competition work its effects in establishing an average rate of profit. In principle, then, capitalist accumulation demands perfect mobility of labor power, and hence, in Marx's words, quote, "the abolition of all laws preventing the laborers from transferring from one sphere of production to another, and from one local center of production to another. Indifference of the laborers to the nature of his labor. The greatest possible reduction of labor in all spheres of production to simple labor. The elimination of all vocational prejudices among laborers. And last but not least, a subjugation of the laborer to the capitalist mode of production." End quote. Where barriers to mobility exist, the force of capitalist expansion attempts to push them aside. If certain obstacles remain in place, they may in part reflect the contradictory position of the capitalist class, caught within the conflicting pressures of its long-term economic demand for perfect mobility, its short-term requirements for different categories of workers, and its need to maintain political and ideological hegemony over a divided working class. To the extent that women remain segregated within and without the labor force, such conflicting factors play an important role. Footnote: Godemar has developed the concept of the tendency toward perfect mobility of labor power. Not once, however, does he consider the barrier formed by the existence of domestic labor and the family household. End footnote. As those primarily responsible for domestic labor, women contribute heavily to the maintenance and renewal of the relative surplus population, as well as the active labor force. Traditionally, as Marx observes, quote, "Society in its fractional parts undertakes for Mr. Capitalist the business of keeping his virtual instruments of labor, its wear and tear, intact as reserved for later use." End quote. The working class pays for most of the upkeep of the surplus population, and working-class women do most of the domestic tasks required. To the extent, however, that women enter wage labor, they become less able to take care of members of the household not presently in the workforce. In a particular situation, the advantages to capital of increased female labor force participation may outweigh the inroads into women's capacity to perform domestic labor. State intervention of various kinds may then become more important in the maintenance of the relative surplus population. In the United States today, for example, elderly and disabled persons increasingly become the direct responsibility of governmental agencies. To this point, the concept of the reproduction of labor power in capitalist society has been developed as an economic phenomenon. Political and ideological issues have entered the discussion mainly in the course of describing the way structural tendencies located at the economic level take specific form in actual societies. There is, however, an important political phenomenon that has its root in the economic workings of the capitalist mode of production: the tendency toward equality of all human beings, a fundamental political feature of bourgeois society, has a basis in the articulation within the economic level of production and circulation. That is not to say that equality of persons, even in formal terms, is an inevitable accompaniment of capitalist relations of production. As it turns out, numerous obstacles get in the way of the development of this tendency. The extent to which the tendency towards equality of persons becomes a reality in a specific society depends on its historical development, and in particular on the strength of popular social movements in the subordinate classes. As Marx showed, the idea of equality takes different forms in different societies, only attaining a firm foundation with the capitalist mode of production. Quote, "Equality and freedom presuppose relations of production as yet unrealized in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages." End quote. Two aspects of equality in capitalist society are of interest for the analysis of women's oppression. First, the manner in which the phenomenon of equality of persons is embedded in the economic workings of the capitalist mode of production itself, and second, the transformations of this phenomenon with the evolution of capitalism. The particular form taken by equality in capitalist society derives, ultimately, from the special character of commodities. A commodity is the product of labor that possesses both value and use value. In the opening pages of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx analyzes the nature of commodities with great care, showing that value arises in a process of equalization of human labor. The exchange of commodities puts forth the great variety of concrete, useful labor that produces them on an equal footing. Through the exchange of these commodities, quote, "the private, useful labor of each producer ranks on an equality with that of all others." End quote. Commodities can be exchanged because they each embody a certain amount of the same thing, human labor in the abstract, that is, value. Quote, "The equality of all sorts of human labor is expressed objectively by their products, all being equally values." End quote. The existence of value requires that differences among various types of labor be disregarded. Quote, "The equalization of most different kinds of labor can be the result only of an abstraction from their inequalities, or of reducing them to their common denominator, vis-a-vis expenditure of human labor power or human labor in the abstract." End quote. In sum, equalization of differences in human labor is a fundamental characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, providing the basis for the formation of value. Expansion of capitalism brings with it, furthermore, an increasing equalization of labor. Accumulation demands that human labor more and more take the form of undifferentiated abstract labor. The very labor power that, when put to use, releases labor, is itself a commodity, albeit a somewhat peculiar one. Like all commodities, labor power has both value and use value. Its value, as we have seen, consists of the sum of values of commodities required for the maintenance and replacement of its human bearer, taking into account the particular historical and moral circumstances. Its use value, from the point of view of the capitalist, is its ability in production to contribute more value than it has itself, thereby yielding surplus value. As a commodity, labor power is bought and sold on the market. The worker enters the market bearing his or her commodity, labor power, and looking for a buyer. Similarly, the capitalist comes to the market, carrying his commodity, money, and seeking to purchase labor power. Each is an owner, desiring to sell a mass of abstract human labor congealed in a commodity. As commodity owners, they are equal traders who meet in the market to contract an exchange, the wage bargain. Their transaction follows the laws of commodity exchange. To buy the worker's labor power, the capitalist must offer a wage that is equivalent to its value. Marx devoted considerable effort to showing that this exchange of equivalence, on the basis of equal rights of buyer and seller, goes hand in hand with the exploitation characteristic of capitalist production. In the sphere of circulation, paradoxically, the requirements of the capitalist mode of production itself decree that equality must reign. In order for capitalists to buy labor power, its bearers must be able to sell it. That is, the bearers of labor power have to enter the market as independent traders, seeking an exchange of equivalence. In Marx's ironic words, wage laborers must be, quote, free in the double sense. First, they have to be free owners of their labor power, able to dispose of it as they wish. They cannot, for example, be enmeshed in feudal restrictions, personally dependent and incapable of autonomous action. Second, they must be free of any other way to put their labor power to use for their own account. Those who have other sources of subsistence will not easily submit to the capitalist demands. It is precisely this double freedom that forces workers onto the market to sell their labor power. Footnote: this double freedom embodies the double separation discussed in Note 3 of this chapter. End footnote. Equality of persons is situated in the sphere of circulation, where labor power is bought and sold. To be sure, Marx observes, the matter looks quite different if we consider capitalist production in the uninterrupted flow of its renewal, and if, in place of the individual capitalist and the individual worker, we view in their totality the capitalist class and the working class confronting each other. But in doing so, we should be applying standards entirely foreign to the wage bargain. End quote. Class relations are rooted in the process of capitalist production, not in the sphere of circulation, where the individual wage bargain is concluded. It is in the production process that the labor power bought on the market is consumed and surplus value produced. In the sphere of production, the rules of exploitation and economic power, rather than political equality, govern relations between capitalists and workers. Powerful forces of class oppression therefore lurk behind the tendency towards equality of persons established in the sphere of circulation. The phenomenon of individual freedom is not, however, an illusory projection of capitalist social relations. Rather, it is a real tendency, bound to class exploitation by the very logic of capitalist reproduction. Capitalism couples political freedom with economic restraint in a tension that is characteristic of bourgeois society. It is this contradiction that Lenin analyzed in terms of the concept of democratic rights. Equality of persons is not, then, simply an abstract political principle or a false ideology. It is a complex phenomenon with material roots in capitalist relations of production. As capitalism develops, more and more social processes come under capital's domination, with accompanying tendencies towards increasing equalization of human labor, and, potentially, increasing equality of persons. In reality, these tendencies meet a variety of obstacles, and history shows that capitalism is, in fact, compatible with a stratified labor market, as well as with highly undemocratic political arrangements. Even in those societies with a relatively continuous history of democracy, the phenomenon of equality of persons undergoes significant transformation over time. In the early stages of capitalist society, the phenomenon of equality of persons emerged against a background of feudal restrictions on property and person. Early capitalism extended an expiring pledge of freedom from such restrictions to all individuals, regardless of personal differences. Slave, serf, or free, propertied or propertyless, man or woman, to each capitalism offered hope of equality, freedom, and liberation. While the pledge of equality was fulfilled for some, large categories of the population ordinarily remained unfree, or at least excluded from full civil and political equality. The Declaration of Independence declared, for example, that it is, quote, self-evident that all persons are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote. Nonetheless, the United States Constitution excluded slaves, women, and the propertyless from equal status as citizens. Much of the history of the last century reflects struggles to achieve the basic freedoms to dispose of one's person and property denied to these groups. Footnote: for good discussions of the nature of equality in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries, see Dawley and Du Bois. End footnote. 200 years after the beginnings of industrial capitalism, gross civil and political inequalities have largely disappeared. Bourgeois society's promise of equality remains in force, however, and campaigns to make it even more of a reality continue. Today, the kinds of personal differences that demand to be equalized are far more subtle. In the United States, for example, blacks and women pursue struggles started long ago, but now with a more finely drawn interpretation of discrimination. In addition, every ethnic or racial group that has a distinct history organizes to eradicate its particular heritage of inequality. And numerous other sectors that have been identified as collectively different. Homosexuals, the elderly, the disabled, ex-mental patients, even the obese, document their discrimination and fight for their rights. Demands for equality in the late 20th century in part reflect the trend towards the perfection of the conditions for the free sale of labor power. At the same time, they embody the high degree of equalization of human labor that occurs with the extension of the sphere of value in advanced capitalism. Subjectively, they reveal an intensification of desire for the freedom promised by capitalism, but never consistently delivered. Indeed, even as people struggle for it, the goal of equality within bourgeois society no longer seems so compelling, for it is increasingly losing its connotations of personal freedom and human liberation. In the closing decades of the 20th century, capitalism's wonderful promises of equality and individual fulfillment clash more openly than ever with its brutal realities. An old question persists, now posed with new energy. Why sell one's labor power, whether on a basis of equality or not, at all? Promising freedom from exploitation itself, socialist movements throughout the world suggest an answer. Given the contradictory character of equality in capitalist society, struggles for democratic rights potentially have serious revolutionary import. To fight for equality means, in the first place, to demand and defend the best conditions possible for people within capitalist society. By their very nature, however, these conditions are severely limited. As Lenin puts it, quote, capitalism combines formal equality with economic and, consequently, social inequality. End quote. The tendency to increasing equality has, therefore, a highly contradictory outcome. The more democratic rights are extended to all persons, the more the oppressive economic and social character of capitalism stands revealed. The struggle for equality threatens the dominance of capitalist social relations on two fronts. It promises to reduce divisions within and among oppressed classes, as well as between these classes and other sectors, by placing all persons on a more equal footing. Simultaneously, it exposes the foundation of bourgeois society to be class exploitation, not individual equality. Far from a useless exercise in bourgeois reformism, the battle for democratic rights can point beyond capitalism. Many groups of varying makeup and character are denied equal rights within capitalist society. Some, like those comprised of persons of African or Native American origin in the United States, have specific histories as oppressed peoples. Their members' lack of equality derives from a history of oppression that relentlessly passes from generation to generation, stamping each person's experience from cradle to grave. Other groups, like homosexuals, the disabled, or the elderly, are made up of individuals with particular characteristics acquired more or less accidentally, and not necessarily shared by kin. These characteristics, which may or may not be permanent, form a basis for discrimination and denial of rights. Women in capitalist societies are neither an oppressed people with a distinct history, nor a collection of individuals with certain characteristics. They are, rather, the 51% of human beings who have the capacity to bear children, which, if done, may replenish capital's supply of labor power. Their lack of equality has, in other words, a specific character that distinguishes it from the denial of democratic rights to other groups. It is a specific character rooted in women's differential place within capitalist social reproduction. Correspondingly, the obstacles to the achievement of real social equality for women have their own character, separable from those blocking equality for other groups. The discussion in this chapter has established a theoretical framework for analyzing women's oppression in the context of capitalist social reproduction. Women's special position in capitalist society has two defining aspects. In the first place, as in all class societies, women and men are differentially located with respect to important material aspects of social reproduction. In the second place, women, like many other groups in capitalist society, lack full democratic rights. The differential location of women and men with respect to social reproduction varies according to class. Working-class women have disproportionate responsibility for the domestic component of necessary labor, that is, for the ongoing tasks involved in the maintenance and replacement of labor power. Correspondingly, working-class men have disproportionate responsibility for the social component of necessary labor, that is, for provision of the means of subsistence that take the form of commodities, a responsibility they can only hope to fulfill by entering into wage labor. In the capitalist class, women may have a disproportionate responsibility for the processes involved in the generational replacement of individual class members, while men may be disproportionately involved in maintaining the processes of capitalist accumulation. The analysis of just which women in contemporary capitalist society fall into the category of working class is not attempted here. It properly forms part of the much debated and still confused Marxist investigation into the contemporary class structure. Insofar as this problem remains unsolved, the movement for women's liberation lacks necessary theoretical guidance. While only certain women perform domestic labor in capitalist society, namely working-class women, whose efforts maintain and renew exploitable labor power, all women suffer from a lack of equality under capitalism, at least in principle. Women's lack of equality constitutes a specific feature of women's oppression in capitalist as opposed to other class societies. Discriminatory conventions that survive from earlier class societies are supplemented and strengthened by newly developed mechanisms of bourgeois political discrimination. Both the legal system and an array of informal social practices support the oppression and inequality of women. At the same time, capitalism promises equality to all persons, and where it fails to deliver in the case of women, the lack is strongly felt. Like other groups denied equal rights, women struggled to achieve them. In the past, the feminist movement focused on the gross inequalities in civil society, especially those embedded in legal codes. In the advanced capitalist countries today, the battle for equality continues and reaches into areas never dreamed of by 19th century feminists. Women fight for equal rights in the so-called private sphere, formerly regarded as largely outside the scope of legal and social redress. For example, they focus on equality in the household, freedom of sexual choice, and the right to bear or not bear children. In the area of paid work, women push the issue of equality beyond demands for equal pay and equal opportunity, by calling as well for equal compensation for work of comparable worth. In essence, recent demands for equality often pose the question of the meaning of formal equality in a society based on real inequity. Advanced capitalist countries have become, furthermore, the first-class societies in which differences between women and men sometimes appear to outweigh differences between classes. In these countries, the expansion of the middle layers of the class structure and the development of a homogenized consumerist lifestyle, combined with the still powerful demarcation between women's sphere of domestic labor and men's sphere of wage labor, to provide a context in which lack of equality with respect to men may seem to be the most consequential social factor in many women's lives. It is all too easy to overlook the fundamental distinction between the working class and other sectors of society. Socialist feminists insist that Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis is not, in any real sense, a sister, but other distinctions tend to fade. The specific character of women's oppression in capitalist societies is established, in short, by women's particular dual position with respect to domestic labor and equal rights. At the same time, women's special status constitutes an obstacle to certain trends inherent in capitalist accumulation. Thus, barriers to female labor force participation and isolation in a private household inhibit the tendencies towards reduction of domestic labor and free availability of labor power. Over time, most capitalist societies in fact experience a reduction of women's isolation, as well as an increase in female participation in wage labor. To the extent that the special status of women continues, it permits discrimination against them that may work in capital's favor. For example, wages for, quote, women's jobs remain notoriously low. At the political level, women's lack of rights comes into increasing contradiction with the tendency to widen the scope of equality in advanced capitalist countries. In the 20th century, the barriers to equality for women have been enormously reduced, revealing the underlying tension between formal and substantive equality. For many women, as for most members of other oppressed groups in capitalist society, bourgeois equality now shows itself as sharply distinct from liberation in a just society. Lack of equality as a group constitutes the basis for women's movements that unite women from different classes and sectors. These movements will differ according to their interpretation, explicit or implicit, of the meaning of equality. Some may, for example, view equality of women and men within bourgeois society as an essentially satisfactory goal. Such movements would quite properly be called bourgeois women's movements. The contradictions of late capitalism make it likely, however, that women's movements will at least have some insight into the difference between bourgeois equality and real social equality. This could form a basis for the development of a women's movement oriented towards socialism. Over the past 20 years, women's movements in the advanced capitalist countries have often shown such potential. Unfortunately, the left has rarely been capable of intervening constructively. Its weakness has resulted, in part, from the lack of an adequate theory of women's oppression. The position advanced here, which analyzes women's oppression in terms of domestic labor and equal rights, differs greatly from much socialist and socialist feminist analysis. Socialist feminist writings often locate women's oppression in capitalist society in their dual position as domestic workers and wage laborers. In a typical formulation, Margaret Coulson, Branka Magus, and Hilary Wainwright assert, for example, that, quote, the central feature of women's position under capitalism is the fact that they are both domestic and wage laborers, that the two aspects of their existence are by no means harmoniously related, and that this dual and contradictory role generates the specific dynamic of their oppression. End quote. Jean Gaudiner has elaborated the same distinction in terms of women's, quote, dual relationship to the class structure. Directly as wage laborers, and indirectly as family members dependent on men and responsible for domestic labor. This argument, which often appears in contemporary socialists as well as socialist feminist work, focuses solely on economic phenomena. It fails to account for the oppression of women not in the working class, and cannot explain the potential for building progressive women's organizations that cross class divisions, nor the possible obstacles to uniting women from distinct racial or national groups into a single women's movement. Put another way, the claim that women's oppression rests on their dual position with respect to domestic and wage labor is economistic. Despite the socialist feminist movement's commitment to the liberation of all women, to organizational autonomy, and to the importance of subjective experience, it has paradoxically embraced the view of women's oppression quite similar to the economism of much of the socialist tradition. By contrast, the argument that women's oppression is rooted in their dual position with respect to domestic labor and equal rights provides a framework for both understanding women's position in wage labor and analyzing how a broad-based women's liberation movement may represent an essential component in the fight for socialism. Although many changes in the character of domestic labor and the status of equal rights have taken place in the era of capitalist domination, women's oppression remains a fixture of capitalist society. As it does in every class society, the ruling class manages, one way or another, to stabilize the reproduction of labor power with a historically established minimum of necessary labor. The current constellation of domestic labor, women's rights, and female oppression represents the outcome of specific struggles over the reproduction of labor power. So long as capitalism survives, domestic labor will be required for its reproduction, disproportionately performed by women and most likely accompanied by a system of male supremacy. It is now possible to situate, in theoretical terms, the working class family in the context of capitalist social reproduction. In essence, the working class family is a kin-based site for the reproduction of labor power. Like most units for domestic labor in capitalist society, it is socially isolated from the realm of wage labor. Ordinarily, the site takes the form of a household, or a series of households linked by networks of mutual obligation. For example, a working-class family may include several generations of adults, with their children, living in adjacent rental units. Or it may consist of two persons, with or without children, living in their own home. In the case of migrant labor, a single worker may participate in two households. One will be in his or her place of origin, and include dependent kin. The other will be at work, and may take the form of dormitory quarters, lodgings, and the like. In most capitalist societies, working-class family households have the major responsibility for the processes that maintain and renew the bearers of labor power. Performance of the domestic component of necessary labor constitutes the material pivot of the working-class family household. Given that this task has historically been carried out primarily by women, in a context usually characterized by male supremacy, the working-class family becomes a highly institutionalized repository of women's oppression. As domestic laborers in the private household, women seem to devote much of their time to performing unpaid services for wage-earning men, a situation that can give rise to antagonistic relationships between the sexes. In addition, women's political and social inequality, and their struggle to acquire rights, provide another potential source of conflict between the sexes. In this atmosphere of chronic tension within private family households, women's oppression may appear to be solely an oppression by men, rooted in a trans-historically antagonistic sex division of labor, and embodied in the family. Nonetheless, it is responsibility for the domestic labor necessary to capitalist social reproduction, and not the sex division of labor, or the family per se, that materially underpins the perpetuation of women's oppression and inequality in capitalist society. These comments provide, it must be emphasized, only a sketch of the material foundation for the working-class family. Its actual form and character vary widely, according to the specific historical development of a given capitalist society. Ordinarily, working-class family experience reflects the contradictory role in capitalist social reproduction of domestic labor and the reproduction of labor power. On the one hand, family life in capitalist society is generally characterized by male supremacy and women's oppression, producing tensions and conflicts that may further fragment an already divided working class. On the other hand, families constitute important supportive institutions within working class communities, offering meaning and warmth to their members, and potentially providing a base for opposition to attempts by the capitalist class to enforce or extend its political, economic, or ideological domination. In other words, the family is neither wholly a pillar of defense and solidarity for the working class, as some socialists would have it, nor an institution so torn by internal struggle and male domination that it must be abolished, as some socialist feminists might argue. Instead, working-class families generally embody elements of both support and conflict, bound together in a dynamic combination that is not necessarily fixed. Concrete investigation will reveal whether the supportive or conflictual aspects dominate in a particular situation. In a successful strike, for example, solidarity within and among working-class families may be a major factor, although this defensive aspect of working-class family life may recede after the conclusion of the battle. Elsewhere, a strike of male workers may be lost in part because organizers fail to involve dependent wives and children in support, thereby heightening already existing tensions in the family. Contention over the family wage, or the sex segregation of the occupational structure, also has roots in the contradictory experience of working-class family life. Indeed, 19th and 20th century social history abounds with case studies demonstrating the key and contradictory role of the working-class family. A haven for its members against the onslaughts of capitalist accumulation, yet simultaneously a concentrated locus of patriarchal relations. In the late 20th century, the success of working-class and popular struggles has become increasingly dependent on the mobilization of women as well as men. Male chauvinism and women's oppression in working-class families represent, therefore, a greater obstacle to the achievement of socialist goals than ever before. A socialist movement that uncritically supports existing forms of working-class family life, or only perfunctorily addresses the problem of female subordination, risks alienating more than half of its activists and allies. Conversely, popular movements that vigorously confront male chauvinism and oppose women's oppression have the potential to lay the groundwork for a future society in which the real social equality of women and men can be built. So long as a society is dominated by the capitalist mode of production, an opposition between surplus labor and necessary labor, and between wage labor and domestic labor, will exist. While it is conceivable that the tendency and struggle for equal rights might reduce sex differences in the performance of the domestic component of necessary labor to a minimum, that minimum would still assign disproportionate responsibility to women in their capacity as childbearers, and potentially provide the material foundation for a system of male supremacy. Extension of democracy, no matter how wide, can never abolish capitalist exploitation, nor can it liberate women. In a society not characterized by class exploitation, the relationship between the processes of surplus production and reproduction of labor power is qualitatively distinct from that characterizing societies in which exploitation dominates. In the former, according to Marx, surplus labor is identified by the nature of its contribution to social reproduction, not by the fact that it is privately appropriated. Surplus labor produces that portion of the total social product that is surplus in several senses. Some of it is reserved for replacing depleted means of production, future expansion, insurance against catastrophe, administration costs, and so on. The surplus product also provides for the collective satisfaction of such needs as education and health care. And it serves to maintain those individuals who, for reasons of age, infirmity, etc., are currently not participating in production. For Marx, necessary labor in such a society seems to simply be labor whose product is directly consumed individually by the producers and their families. End quote. The labor that contributes to the reproduction of labor power is not in antagonistic contradiction, furthermore, with the production of a surplus. Footnote. For the non-antagonistic relationship between surplus production and the reproduction of labor power, see also Marx. Although I follow Marx's usage, his retention of the terms necessary and surplus labor for analysis of non-exploitative systems may be more confusing than helpful, as he himself suggests that when he comments that a part of what is now surplus labor would then count as necessary labor, I mean the labor of forming a fund for reserve and accumulation. End quote and end of footnote. Anthropologists have examined this phenomenon in early human society, arguing that domestic or family production in such a society is public production. For socialists, a classless or communist society in which all labor, whether necessary or surplus labor, forms part of social production, represents the ultimate goal of socialist revolution. To arrive at the goal of communism, society must go through a long period of transition. What becomes of domestic labor, the family, and the oppression of women in the course of the socialist transition? The question can, of course, only find adequate answers in the reality of an actual society's experience. Some general features of the transition period, however, are clear. An opposition between two component forms of necessary labor, the one social or public, and the other domestic or private, continues in force during the socialist transition. Production cannot be organized all at once on a communist basis. Let us keep the term domestic labor to designate the necessary labor involved in the reproduction of labor power performed outside the realm of public production. Evidently, domestic labor plays an important role during the socialist transition. At the same time, it begins a long process of transformation into an integral component of social production in a communist society. As in capitalist society, a tendency exists to reduce the amount of domestic labor carried out in individual households. Rather than embodying the capitalist drive for accumulation, however, it represents the socialist tendency for all labor to become part of social production in a communist society. While reduction of this domestic labor contributes to the development of the productive forces, It does not result from blind tendencies at the economic level. In principle, socialist society lessens the burdens of domestic labor carried out in individual households in a planned and conscious manner, corresponding to the needs of the people as a whole. A major political characteristic of the socialist transition is the formation of democracy. In capitalist society, democracy always remains severely limited. Only male members of the property classes effectively possess the rights bourgeois society promises to all persons. To achieve real social equality, socialist society must eliminate the many restrictions that limit democracy to a small minority. With respect to women, democracy for the majority in socialist society entails, in the first place, equal rights. Here it is immediately obvious that laws alone are not sufficient. As an obstacle to effective equality for women, domestic labor has a stubborn material presence that no legislation, by itself, can overcome. A major index of socialist society is, then, the progressive reduction of the disproportionate burden placed on women by domestic labor. Two paths towards this goal are available. First, domestic labor itself can be reduced through the socialization of its tasks. Second, the domestic labor that remains to be done outside public production can be shared among women, men, and in appropriate proportion, children. Because domestic labor cannot be substantially reduced, much less eliminated overnight, socialist society must take both paths in order to assure women real social equality. Kin-based sites for the reproduction of labor power, that is, families, have a definite role in social reproduction during the socialist transition. In principle, they differ on several important counts from the working-class families in capitalist society. To an increasing extent, all family members take part in public production and political life as equal individuals. At the same time, domestic labor within the family household is progressively reduced. What domestic labor remains is shared on a more and more equitable basis. Existing socialist societies have made important advances in the area of women's equal participation in public production and political life. On the whole, they have been unable, however, to confront the problems of domestic labor and women's subordination in a systematic way. To some extent, efforts have been made to socialize domestic labor, but the oppressive division of labor within the family household remains largely untouched. As a result, socialist feminists sometimes argue that the drawing of women into public production in socialist societies represents not liberation, but the imposition of a burdensome double shift. Only since the 1970s has the question of sharing housework and childcare responsibilities been considered in a few socialist countries. How adequate the concrete steps taken in this area are is a question that requires serious investigation. Footnote: Cuba initiated discussion of sharing housework and childcare responsibilities around 1973, as did China, and the topic was considered in Albania as early as 1967. The Soviet Union has not yet given official support to equalizing domestic responsibilities. For thoughtful studies on women in the socialist transition, see Kroll, Molyneux, Stacy, as well as the works on the Soviet Union cited in Note 7 of Chapter 8. In addition to documenting women's inequality in the household in socialist countries, these studies survey the persistence of a sex division of labor in the areas of public production and political life that likewise disadvantages women. On Albania, see Omved, 1975. End footnote. In the long run, the establishment of effective social equality between women and men in socialist society meets an obstacle in the real differences between them, particularly in the area of childbearing. As a transformation of the contradictions inherent in capitalist society, equality in socialist society has itself a contradictory character. In Marx's words, quote, equal right in a socialist society is an unequal right for unequal labor, end quote. That is, Differences between people mean that equal remuneration for equal amounts of work in socialist society will most likely result in an unequal outcome. Quote, one worker is married, another not. One has more children than another, and so on and so forth. Thus, with an equal output, and hence an equal share in the social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than another. One will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid all these defects, right, instead of being equal, would have to be unequal. End quote. Similarly, real social equality for women will actually require unequal treatment at certain times. Maternity leaves, lighter work during the later months of pregnancy, rest periods when necessary for menstruating women, and so on. In this way, the material conditions for women's full participation in all areas of social life, production, politics, culture, personal relations, and so forth, can be developed. Socialist society does not, it is clear, abolish the family in the sense of doing away with individual social units in which domestic labor is performed. Neither does it eliminate the sex division of labor. What it does do is undermine the foundation for the oppression of women within the individual household and in society. The extension of democracy, the drawing of women into public production, and the progressive transformation of domestic labor during the socialist transition open up the possibility for what Marx calls a higher form of the family and of relations between the sexes. End quote. The exact form such relations will take cannot be predicted in advance. As Engels argues, quote, what we can now conjecture about the way in which sexual relations will be ordered after the impending overthrow of capitalist production is mainly of a negative character, limited for the most part to what will disappear. End quote. It is up to future generations to determine how they wish to live. Quote, when these people are in the world, they will care precious little what anybody today thinks they ought to do. They will make their own practice and their corresponding public opinion about the practice of each individual, and that will be the end of it. End quote. Confronted with the terrible reality of women's oppression, 19th century utopian socialists called for the abolition of the family. Their drastic demand continues to find advocates among socialists even today. In its place, however, historical materialism poses the difficult question of simultaneously reducing and redistributing domestic labor in the course of transforming it into an integral component of social production in communist society. Just as in the socialist transition, quote, the state is not abolished, it withers away, so too domestic labor must wither away. The proper management of domestic labor and women's work during the transition to communism is therefore a critical problem for socialist society, for only on this basis can the economic, political, and ideological conditions for women's true liberation be established and maintained. In the process, the family in its particular historical form, as a kin-based social unit for the reproduction of exploitable labor power in class society, will also wither away, and with it, both the patriarchal family relations and the oppression of women. End section.